Good afternoon. Can anyone tell me what was the worst school mass murder in the history of the United States? We all know of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine assailants. We know of Sang-Hui Cho from Virginia Tech and Adam Lanza from Sandy Hook, and unfortunately many others. All tragic events with countless resultant loss. But none of these tragic events was the deadliest. For that event, we must go all the way back to May of 1927 and to a man named Andrew Kehoe. Andrew Kehoe was 55 years old, treasurer of the Bath Township School Board, and he was embittered and disgruntled over losing an election for town clerk a year earlier, which he perceived as thwarting his political ambitions. His wife was very ill with tuberculosis, and with the family and financial hardship, he stopped paying the mortgage, leading to foreclosure in 1926. He was increasingly incensed over tax increases levied to pay for a brand new school, the Bath Consolidated School. Going into the spring of 1927, he was dejected, bitter, angry, vengeful, and fearful of losing his 80-acre family farm. He blamed the community. He blamed the school. He had a plan. In the early morning light of May 18th, 1927, distraught over his family's poor financial state and his wife's ongoing suffering, Kehoe murdered her in their family farmhouse. He detonated several homemade bombs throughout his farm buildings, destroying them all. This was a planned diversion to drive authorities away from the school, his primary target. At the same time, on that sunny May morning, several miles away, students were gathering in their classrooms to finish exams on the second to the last day of school. Across several previous months, Kehoe patiently and deliberately planted several hundred pounds of dynamite and pyritol under the school floorboards. A skilled electrician who completed handyman services at the school, he had easy access to the building at off hours. On that spring morning, he set the timed charge and detonated the explosives under the floorboards of the north wing of the school. After setting the charge, Kehoe drove his truck away from the school, only to return minutes later, motioning for the superintendent, Emery Huck, to approach the vehicle. As Mr. Huck approached, Kehoe detonated another bomb in his truck, killing himself, Mr. Huck, and several others. Investigators later discovered an additional 500 pounds of dynamite under the south wing of the school, which fortunately did not ignite due to faulty wiring. In the end, Kehoe killed 38 school children, mostly ages 6 to 8, 2 teachers, the school superintendent, and 5 other adults. The Bath School mass murder remains the deadliest school mass murder in U.S. history. Sometime before that May 1927 morning, Kehoe painted on a fence on his farm, "Criminals are made, not born." Today I want to tell a story about violence, a story with which all of us have some familiarity, either directly or indirectly. Yet I will posit to you that despite our familiarity with violence, we collectively misunderstand violence at its most basic level. We routinely fail to make a clear distinction between two primary modes of violence. And in doing so, we often assess violence risk inaccurately, and we employ the wrong interventions. But first, we must go back, way back, to our origins. Borrowing from Monahan from 1994 and Malloy from 2000, a succinct definition of human violence is the following: an intentional act of aggression directed at another human being that causes or is likely to cause physical injury. That definition is recent. The phenomena is ancient, dating back to the beginning of recorded human history. Violence is not new to us. Cain and Abel, the first two offspring, the first two brothers, ended in jealous bloodshed. In May 2015, paleontologists published forensic analysis findings in the journal PLOS ONE of the earliest recorded murder, some 430,000 years ago, death by blunt head trauma. Mass violence is not new to us, as clearly exemplified in Damon Linker's seminal work, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he accounts for numerous episodes of mass killings, both by groups and individuals, dating back tens of thousands of years. And school violence is not new to us either, as we all know from the story of Andrew Kehoe and so many more recent variations. More recently, violence within our society has shown only mild fluctuations in frequency over the past 30 years, including mass violence and mass shootings. The overall risk of any of you being killed in a mass shooting is equivalent to being killed by lightning, roughly 1 in 10 million. Culling archival data of school homicides, including mass shootings, over the past 30 years, forensic psychologist Randy Borum calculated that any given school in the U.S. can expect to experience any homicide about once in every 6,000 academic years. So despite our living with and around violence for millennia, why is it we have such limited understanding of it? To answer that, our story turns next to Frauenfeld, Switzerland, a small German-speaking town just across the border from Germany in the early 1930s, where a young neuroscientist named Walter Rudolf Hess lived. Hess went on to win the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1949, and although that is outstanding for him, that doesn't mean much for our purposes today. What does matter is that well before that, in the early 1930s, Hess really didn't care so much about cats, nor did his colleague, Dr. Konrad Brunner. And although very bad for the kitties, that was quite useful to forensic psychologists like me. Hess and Brunner began studying the subcortical substrates of emotional reactions in animals, namely cats. Yes, cats. So if you're a cat lover, this might be time to cover your ears. Hess and Brunner attached electrodes to the active brains of cats and exposed them to different situations, simulating fight, flight, or hunting, stalking scenarios. Hess discovered two distinct biological modes of violence, one called affective violence, or reactive violence, and the other called predatory violence, or targeted violence. These modes of violence represent two distinct biophysiological modalities of brain activity with clearly distinct anatomical and neurotransmitter correlates. For the past 80 years, subsequent research has found continued support and deepening understanding for this distinction between affective and predatory violence. Yet we collectively, including the disciplines of psychology, psychiatry, and sociology, continue to refer to violence as if it is a homogeneous phenomenon, as if all violence is the same qualitatively, and we continue to get it wrong. And what I want to do today is start the conversation in the right direction so we can start thinking about violence more accurately. So what is affective violence? Picture a typical house cat. Let's call him Fluffy, loosely tethered to a corner of the room with mobility to move several feet, but not to escape. Now imagine a large Rottweiler slowly approaches. What is Fluffy doing? Well, he's not chilling out, that's for sure. He is most likely hissing, back arched, claws extended, scanning his full visual field, ready to run or attack. This is affective violence. It is a fight or flight response. The human correlate is found in crimes of passion, domestic violence, street fights, and road rage. Affective violence is in response to a perceived immediate threat, be that an external threat or an internal threat, such as psychological instability, hallucinations, paranoia, and so on. The key is that the threat is perceived as real and imminent. The primary goal is to reduce the threat, to fight or flee. Affective violence is primarily emotional, defensive, reactive, immediate in its response, and time-limited. Time-limited because we are not hardwired to fend off a threat or run from one for a lengthy period. Evolutionarily speaking, if we needed more than just a few minutes to evade a lion or bear, the adaptivity of that mechanism would not work so well. We became dinner, as did our potential progeny. The overwhelming majority of violence and the majority of workplace aggression is affective in nature. Domestic violence, school and street fights, assaults on law enforcement officers, and officers' excessive use of force on suspects, love triangles gone wrong, bar fights, and tussles over Thanksgiving dinner, all typically affective emotional violence. So what is predatory violence? Now let's imagine Fluffy again, but he's having a much better day. He's in the backyard, the sun is shining, it's early spring, and he's standing some 40 feet away from a bird bath. Suddenly, Fluffy notices a bird fly in and land, enjoying a free drink. Now what is Fluffy doing? Many people may think he's pouncing, but not at that distance, not yet. He's showing a very different behavioral response. He's very quiet, crouched, claws are retracted, ready to stalk but not yet attack, with a laser-like focus on his prey. This is predatory violence. The human correlate is an army sniper, mass shooter, or lone actor terrorist. Unlike affective violence, predatory violence is not a response to a perceived imminent threat. One can certainly perceive the target as a type of threat due to ideological reasons or some future concern, but there's nothing imminent about it. There's no clear and present danger to the safety and security of the attacker. Columbine assailants, Sang Cho, Anders Breivik, Timothy McVeigh, Omar Mateen, the 9/11 attackers, none of these individuals were in imminent danger from their intended targets. This is planned and purposeful violence, which can have many goals: revenge, extortion, sense of duty or patriotism, ideology, religious or otherwise. Predatory violence is primarily cognitive, premeditated, prolonged in its response cycle, and not limited in time. It encompasses the thought process and planning cycle, and not just the final act of aggression. The time window for predatory violence can range from hours to years, depending on the sophistication of the planning involved. Predatory assailants lack the heightened emotionality, fear and anxiety that we see in affective violence. Yet a bit of fear and anxiety can be a good thing. In predatory violence, the degree of focus and lack of emotionality, such as fear and anxiety, has been used to investigators' advantage. On February 26, 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked, the first time, by a group of Islamic terrorists, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000. In the days after the bombing, investigators discovered and traced the VIN number of a van back to the local Ryder rental office. This was the location from where Mohammed Salome, one of Ramzi Youssef's co-conspirators, rented the detonation vehicle. As part of their cover, Salome had reported the van stolen several days prior. 1 week after the attack, looking over his rental receipt, Salome noticed a clause indicating in the case of theft, any rental deposit would be refunded. Now, let's recall that Salome was a seasoned terrorist, well-trained, and clearly knowledgeable of the fact that he and his co-conspirators were on the top of the FBI's most wanted list. So what does he do? On March 4th, he returns to claim his deposit refund. But by then, the FBI planted an agent in the rental office. Salome was arrested, and that is how the FBI initially broke the case. You are the most wanted man in the world at the moment, and you know it. Let the $200 deposit go. But it doesn't occur to him. Often with predatory violence, assailants see the forest, but they miss the trees. They often lack the prerequisite fear and anxiety, which lowers their guard and allows us to catch them when they slip up. Another example. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh detonated a large truck bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Another seasoned terrorist, well-informed and well-knowledgeable of the efforts of law enforcement to find the assailant. Immediately after the explosion, McVeigh is driving north of Oklahoma City on Interstate 35. He was going exactly the speed limit. He was cautious. He was trying to avoid attention. Near the town of Perry, Oklahoma, State Trooper Charlie Hanger was flying 90 miles per hour southbound in response to the bombing. As he passed McVeigh's yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis, heading in the opposite direction and across the highway median, he noticed it had no front license plate. He pulled around and stopped McVeigh. Upon approach to the vehicle, Hanger noticed the butt of a handgun bulging from under McVeigh's vest and inquired, to which McVeigh readily admitted having the weapon. At no point did McVeigh draw the gun. Yet the concealed weapon permit was not legal in Oklahoma, and McVeigh was subsequently arrested for having driven without plates and illegal firearm possession. Again, great on the forest, bad on the trees. Get the license plate. If you're not willing to use the gun, why have it? At least get a permit for it, or put it in the glove box, and so on. That is how we broke the Oklahoma bombing case. So why is this a problem and how do we fix it? The problem is our lack of distinction between these modes of violence. So often we attribute predatory assumptions to people acting out of affective violence. We now know that affective violence is excited by the autonomic sympathetic nervous system. We are physically jacked up in this state. We are not thinking or perceiving clearly. So intervening against affective violence, the primary aim is to help the subject reach emotional equilibrium and feel less threatened. Much affective violence can be treated in various forms through therapy, medication, or threat alleviation. When dealing with affective violence, we should consider treatment, skill building, rehabilitation interventions, and awareness training. In recent years, there has been a great outcry and scrutiny over police use of excessive force. This is a complex problem that involves issues related to racial and cultural bias, profiling, questions about screening and qualifications, concerns about officer training, as well as suspect response to officer directives. Many solutions have been offered. Better officer training, improved community policing, cultural diversity training, and many more. Yet nowhere is there discussion of what type of violence is represented in these interactions and how we can specifically target that type of violence response to reduce risk of harm to all parties. In most cases, affective violence is operating emotional, defensive, impulsive, reactive, and yes, overreactive, and not well planned or thought out. Once we recognize the type of violence, we can then cater the interventions to address how to mitigate that violence. That also requires additional training to modulate one's emotional reactions, use of phrasing and dialogue, awareness of cultural norms, and so on. But it at least requires the officer to be mindful of their own sense of perceived threat and control the overreaction. And the same goes for the suspects in these situations. There's a lot we can offer here once we understand the type of violence. We also often make the mistake of applying affective assumptions to those acting out of a predatory modality. Predatory violence is not preceded by such arousal and is marked by heightened cognitive focus and absence of emotion. With predatory violence intervention, the primary aim is to first identify the concern, then assess the threat risk, and if the risk is significant, then thwart and/or redirect the violent intention of the would-be assailant. Predatory violence is not amenable to treatment, at least none we know of today. When dealing with predatory violence, we should not rule out treatment, but we must be ready to consider remediation and interdiction as primary options. Our concern over mass shootings and lone actor terror attacks is a concern of predatory violence, and we need to shape our detection, assessment, and intervention protocols accordingly. To the extent we can help educate varied professionals and the public on the differences between these violence modes, we may all be better off in understanding the reactions of ourselves and others in tense situations, and hopefully allow more informed decisions about violence prevention programs and public policy. Thank you.